Flight 815 was cruising, the engine's low rumble a steady lullaby. Ethan, a man in a dark coat, slept deeply in Seat 11A, unnoticed by the oblivious passengers. Suddenly the aircraft shuddered, an unnatural tremor that was not turbulence. A sharp warning chime echoed from the cockpit. The cabin atmosphere instantly tightened. Then the captain's voice, slow and strained, cut through the quiet. "Attention all passengers. If there is any fighter pilot on board, please identify yourself." The entire cabin froze. All eyes snapped toward the ceiling. The man in Seat 11A slowly opened his eyes. Ethan Miller was the definition of civilian anonymity. A single father whose life was now a deliberate rhythm of routine and domesticity, he was nothing more than a figure of quiet solitude in economy class. His dark, unremarkable jacket and simple backpack were a conscious uniform, a disguise crafted after years of high-profile, lethal service. He was flying commercial for one solitary, non-negotiable reason: a personal matter related to his family, a path requiring him to cross 3,000 miles quickly. His need for deep, restorative sleep in Seat 11A was born not of comfort, but of habit, the combat reflex of seizing brief, intense periods of rest whenever available. Every morning, he checked the mundane metrics of civilian life: school schedules, grocery lists, car mileage. This peaceful monotony was his deliberate battlefield, fought daily against the ghost of the fighter pilot. He missed the certainty of G-forces, but he fiercely guarded the fragile peace of his current reality. He was simply Seat 11A, and that was his highest rank now. Years ago, Ethan was Major Ethan "Ghost" Miller, a decorated pilot known throughout the Air Force. His aircraft of choice was the F-22 Raptor, a machine he treated less as a vehicle and more as an extension of his own nervous system. His specialty was not simply flying, it was the surgical command of these experimental fighter jets, pushing their asymmetrical limits in the most volatile operational theaters. His call sign, Ghost, was earned for his chilling ability to execute complex tactical missions and vanish, untraceable by conventional means. His mind operated at a terrifyingly efficient speed, processing the lift vectors, thrust asymmetry, and tactical threats faster than the aircraft's own early algorithms. He held an almost symbiotic bond with the machine, understanding precisely where the written code ended and the physical, yielding metal began. His storied career fractured following a high-stakes classified mission. He had vehemently protested a political demand to override core safety redundancies, a risky software change that compromised the flight control loop. The specific failure was the predictive inertial dampening (PID) system. This commercial override, designed for fuel economy and long-haul flights, was never meant to handle the sudden, massive stress of atmospheric anomalies. When a severe, violent wind shear met that corrupted system, the PID attempted to smooth out the immediate chaos, creating a lag in the control surface response instead. The result was a catastrophic, high-altitude failure. The trauma was the unshakable metallic scent of guilt, the memory of loss that no honor could erase. Ethan refused to be a pawn in a game trading human lives for political success. He walked away from the rank, the prestige, and the promise of a generalship, choosing instead a self-imposed exile dedicated entirely to the absolute safety and quiet life of his home. On Flight 815, Ethan was an island of stillness. No one saw the ghost of the pilot in the civilian man. To the passengers, he was just 11A, a weary man catching a nap. The low chatter of the cabin, the gentle whir of the air conditioning, and the faint smell of brewing coffee were all normal, until the first shudder. It was subtle, an internal asymmetry that had nothing to do with atmospheric pressure. A woman 2 rows back complained about cheap turbulence. The flight attendant offered the scripted, practiced reassurance. But Ethan felt the vibration differently. He did not hear the engines with his ears. He registered their unusual frequency and the changing cadence of the air compressor through the soles of his shoes up his spine. This was the true physical language of the machine, revealing a deep-seated truth that the automated systems were still filtering out as mere acceptable noise. Ethan knew the truth. The noise was getting louder, and the digital lie was about to break. He watched the attendant's strained smile, waiting. His predictable world was about to shatter at 35,000 feet. The ghost was already awake. The low, unsettling vibration that Ethan had first detected escalated violently. The entire airframe was seized by a terrifying, sustained rattle that felt structural. Metal on metal protesting its very existence. For 5 gut-wrenching seconds, the plane shook with a chaotic energy. Overhead, bins groaned, and a nervous, collective gasp swept through the cabin. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson and First Officer Harris stared at a primary flight management system, FMS, flashing an inconsistent engine fault. Specifically, Engine 2 was reporting severe, asymmetrical power loss, immediately followed by anomalous, full-power restoration. The readings cycled erratically, contradicting themselves between catastrophic failure and perfect function. The pilots wrestled with the heavy control yoke. Thompson felt the controls grow sluggish, almost liquid, like steering through thick water. Yet the FMS insisted that the control surfaces were fully functional and responsive. Thompson felt something far worse than a sluggish control. He felt the machine actively resisting him. Every attempt to correct the yaw was met with a computerized pushback, a force that felt external and maliciously intelligent. This was the FMS trying to help and, in doing so, creating a feedback loop of destruction. Standard commercial procedures, checking bleed air, fuel cross flow, electrical systems, did not align with the erratic data. Everything felt profoundly wrong, but the instruments offered no stable truth. The skies were clear, the crisis was internal. Captain Thompson's internal battle was terrifying. He was in a machine governed by redundant protocols, yet those protocols were actively deceiving him. The book does not cover this. The aircraft was rejecting inputs designed to save it. Thompson attempted a gentle bank to the right, but the yoke resisted, imposing a gentle, persistent drift to the left. "It's fighting us, Henry," he rasped to Harris. It's dampening our input, treating us like a destabilizing force." He realized the terrifying truth. The machine was prioritizing its own faulty programming over the pilot's human commands. Protocol was now a death sentence. His commercial training told him to trust the instruments. His 20 years of gut instinct screamed the instruments were lying. He needed someone who knew how to break the machine's logic, not follow it. The captain's first transmission was clipped and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing minor control fluctuations. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts immediately." But the cabin was already unraveling. Fear spread like wildfire. A passenger in business class sprang from his seat, shouting hysterically and demanding to know why the oxygen mask hadn't dropped. He then produced a cell phone, trying to capture the chaos. A young woman began to openly hyperventilate. The flight attendants, trained for medical emergencies and small galley fires, were overwhelmed by the sheer psychological terror. Their forced composure crumbled, and their desperate attempts to enforce calm only amplified the underlying panic. The cabin dissolved into a frightening symphony of fear, crying, and the rhythmic, unnatural shudder of the compromised airframe. The plane shuddered again, the deep, grinding sound now unmistakable. The lights flickered and died, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness before the emergency lighting snapped on, bathing the scene in a cold, sickly yellow. The sight of desperate faces illuminated by emergency lamps was Thompson's final breaking point. Thompson knew his time was running out. He was losing the fight against the deceitful FMS. He looked at Harris, whose face was ghostly white with helplessness. They had been taught never to violate command, but the rules were written for a predictable world. This was chaos. The captain made his choice. He risked his entire career, his license, and his freedom, reaching for the microphone again. His voice was no longer slow or calm. It was strained, bordering on raw desperation, yet still absolute. "This is your captain speaking. We are facing a critical technical issue that we cannot resolve with standard protocol. Our flight control systems are compromised. I repeat, if there is any fighter pilot on board, military, tactical, or experimental, we need your unique expertise now. Please, for the safety of everyone, identify yourself and come forward to the cockpit immediately." The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. Nearly 300 souls turned their heads. The atmosphere was so tense that the faint sound of the remaining engine felt deafening. Every eye in the cabin focused, not on the cockpit, but on the single, unassuming man who had been resting in the window seat. Ethan Miller, the single father in the dark coat, slowly pushed the armrests up. He paused for only a fraction of a second, the face of his child flashing through his mind. Then slowly and deliberately, he rose from seat 11A. He walked into the aisle, his gaze already locked on the cockpit door. The chaos in the cabin instantly stilled, replaced by a collective, silent, desperate hope focused entirely on the man no one had noticed. Ethan moved with an unexpected grace, the motion of a man accustomed to sudden, violent necessity, not simple turbulence. He reached the partition. The flight attendant, her face pale with fear, instinctively raised a hand to block him, reaching for her safety checklist. Ethan offered no verbal identification. He simply met her gaze, and the sheer, focused competency in his eyes was absolute. She instantly dropped her hand and stepped aside. The cockpit door was open just a crack. Ethan pushed it fully open, stepping over the threshold into the small critical space. Inside, the two commercial pilots were visibly shaking, struggling against the heavy, resistant control yoke. Thompson, the captain, looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of immense, profound relief and deep doubt as he registered the civilian coat in the man's complete lack of insignia. Twist 1. The revelation of expertise. The lie of the algorithm. Ethan did not offer a name. He did not salute. He took a single controlled step into the cockpit, ignoring the blinking alarms and the pilot's frantic movements. His voice, calm, measured, and instantly authoritative, was his first true command. "Captain, what is your indicated airspeed and your current stick input authority, numerically?" The question was not an introduction. It was a direct, technical query that bypassed the panic and went straight to the core aerodynamic metrics. Thompson, the captain, was momentarily stunned by the authoritative tone, but the phrasing was too specific, too professional to be ignored. 220 knots, and we're showing 50% authority on the pitch, but it feels like the air is fighting back, dead and rubbery. Ethan absorbed the data in a heartbeat. He looked not at the chaotic, blinking computer screens, but at the older, more reliable indicators, the artificial horizon and the vertical speed gauge. The contradictory engine data was confusing the FMS, leading to a specific deadly condition that commercial protocols rarely encountered: a post-stall deep compensation. Ethan's mind was operating at the speed of combat, a relic of his fighter days. While the commercial pilots saw conflicting lights and alarms, Ethan saw the aerodynamic state, the lifting surfaces, the thrust asymmetry, and the false angle of attack (AOA) reading. He diagnosed the algorithmic compensation loop in under 3 seconds. He explained the core failure with terrifying precision. The intermittent failure on engine 2 is providing corrupted data to the FMS's angle of attack (AOA) sensor. The system believes we are entering a stall, even though our speed is stable. This is compounded by the predictive inertial dampening system, which interprets the engine fault as severe destabilization. In a desperate attempt to protect the aircraft, the FMMS is commanding a massive, incorrect pitch-up correction, while simultaneously trying to manage the asymmetrical thrust. You are not fighting the wind, Captain. You are fighting the computer's panic attack. Your plane is not stalled. Your system thinks it is, and it is actively flying you into the ground. He paused, letting the magnitude of the algorithmic betrayal sink in. It is a failure of the algorithm's self-preservation loop. The computer is chasing its own tail, and your input is only adding more chaos to its calculation. He leaned in, pointing directly at the altitude monitor, his hand hovering over the controls without touching a single switch. He was now operating purely as an external tactical advisor, a voice of absolute, irrefutable truth. You must execute a counterintuitive dive. Reduce pitch severely. You need to drop your nose and gain speed immediately. Now, you must bypass the system's compensation loop entirely by taking the machine into an attitude the FMS wasn't programmed to handle. You have to commit to the dive to prove the computer wrong. Thompson looked at him, genuine, paralyzing terror in his eyes. Every single ounce of his commercial training screamed against that action. Never dive in an unknown condition. Never ignore a pitch warning. He hesitated, his hands tightening on the yoke. If I commit to that dive, and you are wrong, we impact in seconds. The alarm is screaming. The first officer, Harris, openly choked out a final, futile protest. Dive. At this altitude, the ground proximity alarm is going off. Ethan's gaze snapped to him, cold and absolute. The ground proximity alarm is a lie. The speed is the truth. Now, Captain, or you'll run out of sky while arguing with a glitch. Ethan moved his hand, not to the yoke, but to the captain's shoulder, a single firm point of grounding. Thompson, trust your speed. Reduce pitch now. Full forward yoke. Override the computer. Break the protocol, or the protocol will break the plane. In that moment of absolute professional surrender, Thompson saw past the worn coat and the civilian face. He saw not a janitor, but the ghost. A man whose career was built on doing the impossible, counterintuitive thing that saved the aircraft. He pushed the yoke forward against every instinct, every rule, and every programmed warning. The physical strain of overriding the digital resistance was immense. Thompson grunted with the effort. The plane dipped sharply. A fresh, desperate wave of panic broke out in the cabin as gravity seemed to momentarily vanish. The nose plummeted. Then, the miracle. The airspeed instantly jumped. The controls became taut and responsive, and the deep, grinding vibration vanished, replaced by the steady, familiar drone of the engines. The FMS, momentarily confused by the sudden, aggressive maneuver, reset its false stall compensation loop. The aircraft stabilized, smooth and steady, cutting through the air like a knife. Twist 2, the authority of decision, the unmoved hand. The crisis was averted. The cabin slowly quieted, passengers clinging to their seats, uncertain if the danger was past. Ethan stood beside the captain, his entire body relaxed, breathing normally while Thompson was drenched in sweat. He had not touched the yoke. He had not touched a single switch button or dial. He had only spoken. His role was not to fly the plane, but to provide the singular, perfect, counterintuitive decision based on his experience reading a failing machine in a combat scenario. The captain, trusting that absolute conviction, had executed the command. Thompson and Harris exchanged terrified glances. They were watching a civilian, a stranger, solve a crisis that defied their multi-million-dollar training programs, all without laying a finger on the controls. The captain looked at him, genuine shock and profound gratitude etched on his face, his voice barely a whisper. You saved us. That was impossible. Who are you? Ethan looked past the captain, his gaze distant, focusing only on the distant horizon. He was already done with the glory. I'm just here to get to my family, he said simply, omitting his daughter's name. The past was irrelevant. The present was all that mattered. The immediate risk is over, but the FMS will likely remain unstable. We need to address the asymmetrical thrust issue. I recommend an immediate, non-urgent diversion to the nearest international airfield with full maintenance capabilities. Let's get this bird on the ground before the computer decides to fight back again. His authority was absolute. The crisis had confirmed that his stillness was not inertia, but the ready state of absolute competency. He was the ghost in the machine, and he had just reset the entire system with a single command. The cockpit fell into a focused, almost reverent rhythm. The initial danger had passed, but the plane was still flying on compromised systems. The captain, following Ethan's guidance precisely, issued the required air traffic control request for an immediate diversion to Halifax International, the nearest suitable airport. Thompson worked his equipment while mentally acknowledging the monumental failure of his commercial protocol. Thompson keyed the radio. Halifax Center, this is Flight 815 Pan Global. Request immediate diversion due to flight control systems anomaly. We require priority landing and maintenance access. Fuel and passengers stable, but we are operating under degraded autonomy. He avoided using terms like structural compromise or pilot override, maintaining professional vagueness. Legally, what I just did, overriding the FMS, is grounds for immediate grounding. Maybe worse, Thompson confessed, his voice heavy with the possible consequences. But thank God it was the only choice. Our training covers mechanical failures, fire, electrical failure, but not algorithmic deception. Ethan gave a concise explanation, his voice professional and flat, devoid of ego or fanfare. You made the right decision, Captain. The failure was systemic, not pilot error. Document everything but focus the report on the sensor conflict and the PID system's aggressive, contradictory response. I can detail the aerodynamic hypothesis for maintenance. Commercial aircraft are designed for predictability. Fighter jets are designed for chaos. When the algorithm fails in a complex system like this, the only way out is a counterintuitive maneuver. You have to violate the failed logic to restore the physical truth. It's a combat instinct. The speed was the truth, Captain, not the pitch alarm. We have to fly the machine, not the screens. He pointed to the manual thrust levers. Keep engine 2 throttled slightly back from the FMS command. Fly it by feel now, no more automation. He offered no story, no details about his past life as Major Miller. He did not mention the missions, the awards, or the trauma. He didn't boast of the lives he saved. His focus was pure. Get the plane safely on the ground for his family. He constantly scanned the secondary systems, ensuring no cascading failures occurred in the hydraulic or electrical backups. The chief flight attendant, who had been listening silently at the door, her hands still trembling, returned to the cabin. Her voice, though shaky, was calmer, authoritative, and factual. Ladies and gentlemen, we are diverting to Halifax International Airport as a precaution. The aircraft is now under full control. We need full cooperation during the descent. Please remain absolutely calm. The change in the cabin was profound. The initial terror had been replaced by a deep, palpable silence. A silence not of panic, but of awe and compliance. The passengers were hushed. They had witnessed the desperation, the sharp nose-down dip, and the subsequent immediate stillness. They were no longer frantic, they were obedient. Every movement, every decision was now being scrutinized through the silent presence of the man who had risen from seat 11A. As the plane banked gently toward the Canadian coast, Ethan checked the approach charts the first officer pulled up, confirming the diversion route was safe. He then gave the final, critical instructions before the landing sequence began. Monitor engine 2 manually, maintain your current approach profile, but keep your speed slightly high, just above the flap deployment threshold. Don't trust the computer's drag calculation for the final approach. This bird will be heavy to slow down, and we need the extra speed in case that compensation loop cycles again. He added, keep the hydraulic pressure steady. No sudden movements on the flaps or slats. We are easing it in. The captain nodded, his every action now completely subservient to the technical authority standing beside him. He began the final checks. The plane descended steadily. The entire cabin, holding its collective breath, moved with it, a single silent entity trusting the quiet civilian who had stood up in the moment of ultimate chaos. The landing was executed with flawless, professional precision, a testament to Captain Thompson's skill under extraordinary pressure. The massive aircraft settled gently onto the runway at Halifax International, the tires kissing the tarmac with a soft puff of smoke, before coming to a final, perfect stop far from the main terminal. The moment the engines ceased their power and the aircraft was fully parked, a stunned, emotional silence held for 3 full, heavy seconds. Then the cabin erupted. Cheers, shouts, and spontaneous roaring applause crashed through the plane, echoing off the metal walls. Passengers began unbuckling their belts, turning in their seats, desperate to see, to touch, to thank their hero, the man from 11A. But Ethan Miller was already gone. He had quietly slipped out of the cockpit the very moment the plane touched the runway. He returned to his seat, pulled his worn backpack onto his lap, and remained utterly still, blending back into the anonymity he craved, waiting for the aisle to clear. He offered no statements, made no grand gestures. The work was done. His focus was already on his next flight, his next meeting. As the crew began to open the doors for the emergency ground crew and the first responders, Captain Thompson exited the cockpit. He saw Ethan in the economy seat, waiting. Thompson, the man who commanded the respect of 300 passengers, walked slowly down the aisle, ignoring the passengers who were trying to shake his hand and thank him. He stopped beside seat 11A. He did not speak a word. He simply extended his hand, palm up, in a profound, silent gesture of respect that surpassed the bounds of rank and protocol. Ethan looked up at the captain, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He took the captain's hand, offering a firm professional handshake that spoke volumes without a single word. It was the handshake of two pilots, one who understood the rules and one who understood the truth of the air. The chief flight attendant, the woman who had initially looked past him in the aisle, came forward. She stopped, placed both hands together, and gave him a low, traditional bow, a gesture of thanks that transcended language, protocol, and service hierarchy. Ethan merely nodded, acknowledging the silent honor. He then stood up, pulled his coat on, and calmly walked toward the exit, blending instantly into the stream of relieved, chattering passengers. He looked like any other tired man, eager to catch his connection. He passed the woman who had complained about cheap turbulence and the man who had screamed in panic. They looked at him now, their faces etched with reverence, but they could never truly name the man who saved them. They would only remember the man who stood up when no one else could. He was just a single father with a backpack, leaving a flight that would become the most legendary, whispered moment in that airline's history. No news outlet would ever find his name. No passenger would ever truly know his identity. But in that small, pressurized tube of metal, a moment of profound truth had occurred. Ethan had proven that the highest form of power is not found in title, but in the unwavering stillness of courage and competence. No one on that flight ever dared to call him just a passenger again. A single, desperate question had changed everything. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Single Dad Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.